All right, good morning, guys. Let's go ahead and get started. Thank you for showing up for a second day of 8 a.m. So hopefully you're gonna stick around. We're gonna go ahead and go through the first lecture today, which we're gonna kind of just cover some basics about websites and kind of how they work, and kind of start talking about HTML a little bit. And then after that, I'll do kind of a walkthrough of all the steps for the first assignment. So kind of how to get the code for the first assignment, how to submit it, how to get your page hosted on GitHub, that kind of thing. It's pretty simple. Some of you have already kind of followed through the steps, so that's great. So after the lecture, I'll let you know if you are already done with that. You can leave, but if you still want to kind of go through that walkthrough of how to get all that stuff set up, I'll kind of walk through that with you, and then we'll stick around if you need help with anything too. Okay, so start talking about websites. So how people access the web. So important thing when we're building websites is kind of being knowledgeable about how people access the web. So obviously mobile browsers, that's not showing anything useful. One second. Okay, sweet. How people access the web. Let me make that. So obviously, web browsers are the way to load a website, right? You have to use Google Chrome, Safari, Firefox, Internet Explorer. These are all different, companies that have built these web browsers. Some of them share the same underlying technology, like Google Chrome and Safari actually both use what's called WebKit, kind of behind the scenes. So they're sort of use the same rendering engine, but Firefox and Internet Explorer are completely different. These companies that have built these web browsers have written their own implementation of how to render HTML and CSS into a visual thing that you see on the screen. So they all kind of have their own quirks too. You may have even noticed that sometimes when you load a website, it'll be a little bit different in different browsers because those browsers are entirely different in the way that they should all match the same standard, but sometimes there's little quirks here and there. Mobile devices, obviously, huge, only growing people accessing websites via their mobile devices. It's gotten so much better. I remember back when I was in college and I had a little tiny phone and I could load a web page on it, but it wasn't like a mobile web page. It was just the web page shrunk to fit the little tiny screen. You had to zoom in to see it. So you guys have it a lot better now. A lot of websites automatically adapt to your mobile device, right? Like it automatically changes the menus around, it automatically changes the layout, makes the fonts the right size, which is really nice. So that's one thing that we have to keep in mind, and we'll talk about that a little bit, as we, learn to use CSS for layouts, like how do we optimize for mobile and things like that. Mobile devices also have different interaction behavior, which is really important. Can anyone think of kind of some of the differences that you have with mobile devices versus a desktop computer? Yeah, right. So you're touching it with your finger. You don't have a visible cursor anywhere. You don't really hover with a mobile device, right? Like, with your mouse, you can kind of like hover over things or right click on things, but you don't really have that on mobile devices. You also have scrolling, swiping, different types of gestures, things like that. So we have to keep all these things in mind. Very different on mobile devices. One thing I really want to emphasize, and something that we'll talk about throughout the course too, is screen readers. So screen readers are just, they speak the content of the website aloud for those who have hearing impairments, with visual impairments. So really important that we optimize our websites for screen readers. So like the American Disabilities Act has set a bunch of guidelines for how to make sure our websites give contextual information in their content, so that those using screen readers can actually hear, it doesn't just read the words, but it will kind of give them some context and help them understand, like, what does the layout look like? What's a sidebar? What's a main area? What's a header? These kinds of things, so that they can actually use the websites well. So as web developers, we have an obligation to consider those users too. And it's something any professional web development you do. I run this into my job a lot, because a lot of our clients, a lot of the users of our website are at universities or at businesses, and with the American Disabilities Act, I believe it's 2019 when it's like required that any government website, so like state schools and stuff like that, they have to conform to the American Disabilities Act standards. So we're all kind of catching up now, because that's coming up pretty soon, really. So a lot of people have had to do a lot of work. I did. Our website was initially built back in 2007, and so kind of back then they didn't really have screen readers. It wasn't as much of a thing, and there was no American Disabilities Act with all of these guidelines. So they didn't build the site originally with any of that in mind. So we've had to go through every part of our website and modify things and figure out how to make it more accessible to those with visual impairment. So really, really important. And if you ever have a job in web development, that's going to be something that's going to come up. So it's good to kind of think about that from the beginning. Same goes for mobile devices. If you try and take a non-mobile website and make it mobile friendly, it's really hard. But if you start from scratch, thinking about mobile, thinking about different screen sizes, it's going to be so much easier. So that's kind of why I hit this very first slide. In web development is to really think about your users and what kinds of capabilities do they have, what kinds of adjustments are their devices going to need. So again, yeah, the American Disabilities Act provides those guidelines, and we'll kind of talk about some of those as we go on. This is a screenshot. This is from back in August, so this is probably even a little bit out of date now, but if you go to analytics.usa.gov, it's really cool. They provide analytics information for all federal government websites. So this is the breakdown for any federal government website, anything that's a .gov. This is kind of their analytics breakdown. So you can see desktop has a 55% share, so just barely more than half. Mobile being 39%, and tablet just at a little under 6%. So obviously tablet isn't as large of a segment. It's kind of between desktop and mobile. You can see kind of the browser breakdown. Chrome has really taken over the last couple of years from Internet Explorer, which is a good thing, really. Firefox being down towards the bottom. Operating system. So again, it just goes to show like all of the different things that impact the way people see your websites. I'm kind of curious. Let me see if they analytics.usa.gov. Wonder if it's any different. This website's really interesting too if you're curious to kind of poke around on. They give you, they give geographic information, really, really interesting. They make this available. They give like a live view. They show the top sites. So these are, some of the top sites within the, federal websites that are being viewed. So here's their, so 55.1. So that's going down slightly, but it's only been 6 months. They give, visitor locations, It's really interesting. You can dive into some other stuff too, or you can look at analytics for specific websites as well. So it's very cool the way that they do that. This is the mobile breakdown from a website that I built a while ago for a church, like just a local church. And I thought it was really interesting kind of comparing the breakdown for them because they actually have almost the opposite usage. So mobile is 55% and desktop is 37%. And I thought that was really interesting when I saw that it's literally the opposite of the federal websites. And it's honestly like when I looked at the federal analytics, I'm like, that seems a little desktop heavy from some of my experiences as I've seen for websites I've worked on. And so does anyone have any ideas why, federal websites might have a little bit higher desktop usage versus, a nonprofit or a local business or some sort of organization? Any thoughts on that? Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's a lot of content on federal sites. You're probably doing something kind of important. You're not just quickly looking something up usually if you're going to a government website. Yeah, absolutely. That's probably the biggest thing. And also, a lot of the federal websites, you're putting in information, probably a little more planned. So yeah, there's just kind of a different interaction. So, even though, the federal websites have a little bit higher desktop usage, in the real world, honestly, mobile is kind of more or less taking over. So it just makes it all the more important for us to consider that, right, as we develop our websites. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about web servers, so where websites come from. So technically, any computer can be a web server, but they're typically purpose-built to be kind of high-performance, low-power, and low-maintenance computers. So whenever we talk about a web server, all it really is a computer. It's not any special. It's not different than your regular, desktop computers, other than its form. It's in a different shape, right? And kind of has different components. But special software is installed on web servers to serve the web pages. So you'll hear things like Apache or Nginx. Those are kind of the two most popular web servers that will take, some sort of back-end programming code to generate the web pages, or just take the HTML files and render them and deliver them to the clients as they request them. Web servers can use any operating system, so Windows, Mac, or Linux. Usually there's kind of special versions of those, so like there's Windows Server, there's Mac OS Server, there's Linux Server. So they're usually kind of special versions. Usually, sometimes they don't even have like a graphical interface because usually you don't plug a monitor into a server, you just access it remotely via the command line. So like Ubuntu, which is the Linux distribution, is probably the most popular right now, kind of between that and Windows Server for running a web server. And Ubuntu, you don't, click around on anything. You just access it all remotely. We won't get into, web servers within the scope of this class, but, it's good to understand how it works. So web hosting companies run large specialized web servers that act as servers for many, many websites. So if you sign up for, website hosting at like GoDaddy or something like that, they'll give you access to one of their web servers, and they'll give you kind of your own little compartmentalized, section of it. But you're usually not getting access to an entire server. They just kind of give you your own little folder on it where you can put your files, and they'll give you some controls over what you want. Beyond that, there's also like virtual private servers. If you heard of a VPS, that's where you get kind of like it's still an abstraction, but it's kind of your own little world within an existing server. Or if you really want to, if you need to run a beefy website, you'll have dedicated servers where an entire server is just for your website, or maybe multiple servers that all handle just your website. So kind of scales that way. There's all different options. And web hosting, if you guys have ever looked into like buying web hosting, it can be anywhere from $5 a month to $100 a month or thousands of dollars a month. For my website I work on at work, I think we spend about $6,000 a month. And we have about 20 dedicated servers that are all pretty large. So it can get really expensive if you're serving, a website to hundreds of thousands of people every day. So it can get really expensive quick. But if all you need is just, a really simple site, web server or web hosting can be really cheap. Here's a fancy picture of some web servers. You might be familiar with something like this. I think there's even some in this building somewhere that I saw once. Usually they're kind of rack mounted like this. So each one of those little things is a server, and they're all kind of connected together via networking. Sometimes they might be load balanced, or they're all kind of, pooling resources to create one big powerful server, something like that. And here's kind of the inside of one of those. If you've ever built a computer, kind of looks familiar. Again, it's got a motherboard and a hard drive and a power supply like any other computer. They're just kind of purpose-built components for web servers. So think about it, web servers run 24/7 all day, every day. They never get shut down. They're built to not get shut down. They're built to kind of run continuously. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the cloud. So the cloud simply refers to large shared computers that you can use a part of for your web server. So some really popular cloud services are like Amazon Web Services, or Microsoft Azure, or Google Cloud, or DigitalOcean. So these are services that that just kind of, they virtualize the servers for you. So they have a data center full of servers, and they give you some slice of that based on however much you want to pay for. So that's what we use at work. We use Amazon Web Services. So our servers aren't like actual servers that we have in a closet somewhere. The servers are somewhere in Amazon's data centers. We don't know where they are. We don't care where they are. We just need access to them. So we tell them, okay, like we need this many. We'll pay you this much. And they say, okay, here's your access credentials. Here's your IPs, for those servers. So they give us access to them. So that's why the cloud is so popular, because before the cloud kind of became a thing, any company that wanted to have their own website would have to buy servers. They'd have to maintain those servers. They'd have to pay for the power for those servers. You'd have to have a closet somewhere. It's kind of a pain. They're loud and noisy. I used to work in an office where we had a rack of servers, and it was a pain. Like, they're loud. If they get hot, we had it in like the separate room where we would like eat lunch and stuff. And it's like hot in there because they've got fans running. Anyway, no one wants to deal with that. That's kind of what the cloud has brought, is this abstraction. So Amazon and Google can have these massive buildings with hundreds of thousands of servers inside them, and they sell you a slice of those based on your needs. So there's some pros to this. Obviously, it's cheaper. Usually, it's also pay for usage. So there's some cloud services where you just pay for what you need. You don't have to, and you can scale up or scale down on demand. There's even now you can literally just say like, we've got some that are like these that are like burstable cloud servers, where like as your demand starts going up, like we've got peak times for our website, like around lunchtime is kind of the time when our website's used the most. So our servers automatically kind of scale up. It sort of just knows that, okay, around this time, add some more beef to it, give it some more capacity. They're easier to use. You don't have to plug things in. You don't have to like manage storage and everything. And usually they're automatically managed. So again, like, it's just a little bit easier to take care of. There are some cons. There's some security risk. Again, you're trusting Amazon or Google with the physical security of your hardware. So technically someone could break into a data center and steal a hard drive and load that up at home and find some data on it. Now, that's why Amazon and Google take their security very seriously. You don't know where they don't tell you where their data centers are. If you were to find one, they wouldn't let you within 50 feet of it. They take their security very, very seriously. There's also some just, inherent security risk to running on shared hardware, right? You're trusting the software that manages the servers to not allow, your servers are all in the same building, they're all connected together. One customer could find a way to break into another customer's server somehow. That's definitely possible. The latest, if you guys have heard of like the Meltdown or the Spectre vulnerabilities that have kind of popped up over the last month, some of that's related to that. Our Amazon servers had to be rebooted It was back in like December, and we didn't know why. They sent us a message, and they're like, for security reasons, like we're kind of refreshing everyone's servers. We have to take it offline for like 2 seconds while we reboot the hardware. And it was because of that bug. Like there was a bug in the processor chips, like in the Intel chips running on the servers, that would allow remote execution, or it was like remote memory read. So you could technically read other customers' data. So someone else who pays for Amazon cloud hosting, could read our data due to a flaw in the processor. It's really mind-boggling. But so they had to mitigate that with software, the software that manages that separation. So anyway, definitely some security risk. You have some less control. You're kind of restricted to the options that they give you. And you also have vendor lock-in, which is something that we take pretty seriously, because if there ever were issues with Amazon, or if Amazon decided to raise their prices and something else was cheaper, a lot of our tooling is built around Amazon's specific environment. So we would have to really change the way we do things and spend a lot of work to migrate to another cloud vendor or something like that. So there's definitely some cons to using the cloud. Everyone's kind of jumped to it for how easy it is, but there's some issues with it as well. Okay, so a little bit more about how the web works. So websites are accessed by a URL, which stands for Uniform Resource Locator. The URL consists of a few different parts. So the first part is the protocol, or the scheme, which is the HTTP:// or HTTPS://. HTTP stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol. Hypertext kind of referring to HTML, which we'll learn when we talk about HTML. And HTTPS stands for HTTP Secure, and all data is encrypted between your browser and the web server. HTTPS at this point should almost always be used. If you're ever on a website, you can tell if it's HTTPS. One, it says HTTPS, but then second, by that green lock up there. All browsers have that, and they're indicating whether or not it's a secure connection. I recommend you get in the habit of kind of glancing up there, especially if you're on some sort of important website or anything where you're putting in financial details. And at this point, there's really no excuses for websites to not use HTTPS. If you don't use HTTPS, anyone in the middle between your browser, your computer, and the server where that website is located can see the data going back and forth between your browser and the server, right? So it's just a completely open connection. So that means like your internet service provider, they can see that information. They can see everything you put in the website. They can see what website you're on. They can see the contents of the website. They can see the contents of any form you submit. Not only the internet service provider, but any other internet service providers in between, Charter or whatever your internet service provider is and the web server, as well as any malicious actors. So someone on the same Wi-Fi as you could snoop your traffic and read the traffic going back and forth and see all the information. It's a huge deal. So HTTPS actually encrypts the data. So when you first load a website via HTTPS, it does some key exchanges and sort of does some cryptographic stuff so that you can establish a secure connection. So all the data going back and forth is encrypted, and no one else can read it except your browser and the web server you're talking to. So it keeps your internet service provider from seeing all that information. Anyone sitting in the middle, man-in-the-middle attacks is what we refer those to, or what we call those. They can't see it, so hugely important. There was a thing a while back, this was when I was in college, called like Firesheep, I think, but it was before HTTPS was as popular, and like sites like Facebook didn't use HTTPS. So if someone developed just a browser extension to show how easy it was to snoop on other people on the same Wi-Fi. So if you're on the same Wi-Fi as someone, it would just pop up and say, okay, here's this person. Here's a link to their Facebook, and you could log in as them, because things like your authentication cookies and your passwords were all shared over the open, unencrypted, so anyone else on your Wi-Fi could see that, and they could get your password just because you went to facebook.com and typed in your password. So you could just like log in as anyone else on your Wi-Fi, and it was a huge deal, and it changed. It is part of what changed this and made HTTPS a lot more standard. Because everyone was like, oh crap, I can't go on any Wi-Fi anywhere and go to Facebook because someone can log in as me. That's a pretty big deal. So anyway, HTTPS is huge, really important. You should get used to checking for that. It's a big deal. After the protocol or the scheme is the domain. So this is the main address of the website, so like google.com, something along those lines. The domain technically is just the google.com part. Anything before, like www. This would be considered a subdomain. So www. Is a really common subdomain. It's a little bit old-fashioned. It's not necessary to do www. Most websites don't require you, so you can just go to google.com and it'll get you where you want to go. Again, it's kind of old school. It stands for World Wide Web. It was kind of before, it was just from an earlier time in the internet, but it's still a really common pattern, so you see that a lot. Or like docs.google.com, something like that. The docs part is a subdomain. So anything that comes before the main domain is considered a subdomain. The .com part is called the top-level domain, or the TLD, and it can be many options, as you know. And it's even opened up over the last couple of years. It used to be you just had .com or .net or .edu or .gov, and there were really strict requirements. Even like no one can just buy an edu domain. You have to actually be a university or a school. But now they've opened it up to pretty much anything, right? So you can have, you know, I don't know, literally anything, I think, at this point. So you start to see that .io is really popular now. But they've really opened it up to any top-level domain that you want. So after the domain is the path or the file name. So, you know, like /folder /index.html or something like that. It doesn't always include a file extension. Like if you go to Google and search, you never see like a .html in the URL. It doesn't have to include that. But HTML is kind of the default. And then a domain with no path is called the root of the domain. So it's just google.com. You're going to the root of that website, and not like google.com/search/whatever. That would not be the root of the website. Any questions so far? By the way, feel free to raise your hand or interrupt me. I don't mind. So. Okay, here's kind of a illustration too, and this has a couple of extra things in it. But again, we've got the scheme that defines how the resource is obtained. There's other options other than HTTP too. So like FTP, which is like a file transfer protocol, you can have URLs using the FTP protocol. There's other types of protocols as well. We've got the subdomain, domain, top-level domain. This also talks about the port, which we won't really talk about in the scope of this class. Then again, you've got your path. So after the .com/something, this is your path here. And then this also talks about query strings, so you can use a question mark to sort of identify a parameter with a name and a value that gets sent to the server as well. So you'll see that a lot for like searches. You know, you might have question mark search equals, and then your search string, whatever you've put in the search box. You can also identify a fragment. So using this # and then some ID, you can jump to a specific part of the website. So we'll talk about that a little bit more throughout this class, but it's kind of handy to be able to jump to a specific area on the website. Okay, one thing that has to happen before you can load a website is your computer needs to know the IP address of the server hosting the website in order to download the file. So IP addresses look like this. So this is an IPv4, which is kind of the old dying way of an IP address. These numbers, that's literally the address, the networking address to a server. And then this is IPv6, so this is a hex-encoded IP address. It's a new version. It's growing. We've literally run out of IPv4 addresses. You can tell it's not that long. There's only so many options, and literally we've run out. There are no more IPv4 addresses to be had. There's more computers now than there are possibilities for those IP addresses. So IPv6 is kind of the growing, sort of the replacement. So you don't really need to know much about those other than kind of what they look like. So after you've typed in a web URL like google.com, your browser first queries what's called a domain name system, or a DNS server, which knows the IP for that domain. So there's these DNS servers that have a registry of domain names and IP addresses. So when you say, I want to go to google.com, your browser needs to know what the IP is for google.com. It'll look that up to a domain name server first, which returns, okay, here's the IP that you need to go to. DNS servers are run by internet service providers usually, as well as large companies like Google and Microsoft. So you don't know what the DNS server for your computer is because your internet service provider just has a default one that it routes you to. And your browsers also cache that. So once you've gone to google.com once, you usually don't have to look up its IP again because your browser remembers what the IP address is. So you also never really see the IP address. It's just kind of behind the scenes. You still see, obviously, google.com in the browser bar, but behind the scenes, it's using the DNS and the IP to actually load the data. So once your computer knows the IP address of the server, it makes a request to the server for the URL, and the server processes the URL and returns the requested resource, usually in the form of an HTML file. If you want to kind of read some more about this, that's kind of as deep as we're going to get into it because we don't really look at, setting up web servers or any sort of networking concepts in the scope of this class. I'm just kind of trying to give you a little bit of background. But if you want to read some more about it, there's a couple links here into, kind of how this process works. It's really fascinating. I find it really fascinating, kind of how the web developed and how this technology kind of works and what changes are being made to it. Google's been doing a lot of work on a new version of HTTP, HTTP 2. They kind of have some new features that's starting to slowly roll out. So there's always changes being made to this kind of underlying technology of how the internet works. It's also really fascinating. It's sort of democratic. Like there's a bunch of different companies and organizations that are all contributing and trying to influence all these decisions being made about like what the standard way to do websites are. And so it's kind of interesting to follow. Obviously Google and Facebook and Apple are huge players in that because they have a lot at stake. They have a lot of influence as large companies. As providers of popular websites, they have a lot of influence over how the internet works, which is kind of crazy when you think about it. So anyway, really interesting stuff, but I'll show this. Mostly, though, we just care about how to actually make a website, so we'll dig into that. Again, here's just an illustration of how it works. So when you go to foobar.com/index.html, your browser first queries the DNS server and says, what's the IP of foobar.com? Returns the IP address, so now your browser knows where to route that request, so it can make a request to foobar.com to the web server. Okay, so what we're actually interested in the scope of this class is how websites are created. Websites are created using kind of three different technologies. So the first is HTML, which stands for Hypertext Markup Language. This provides the structure and the content of the web page. So HTML purely is about the structure. How is your data structured? What are the sections? What are the headings? What are the forms, that kind of thing, as well as the content. So the words on your page comes from the HTML. HTML, it's a markup language. It's not really a full programming language. People will refer to it as a programming language, but it's not really. It's a markup language. So it's a way to take text and add some more data to it, add some markup to it to give that text meaning and structure. There's another markup language called Markdown that you may have used where you can use a pound sign to create a heading, stuff like that. Similar concept. Also similar, it kind of has some roots in XML. If you're familiar with XML at all, it's kind of similar to that in some ways. CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets, and this is what provides the actual styling for our HTML. So the HTML doesn't care what your website looks like, other than maybe the structure. HTML is just concerned about the content and the meaning of your content and the structure of your content. CSS cares about what your page looks like. So it's all the styling, the font sizes, the colors, the sizes of sections. If you want to make a sidebar that's 200 pixels wide, you do that with CSS. CSS is purely the styling. We'll talk about why it's called cascading in a little bit when we dig into CSS. But CSS is just styling. Also, not really a programming language. It's a I don't know what it is. It's not a markup language. It's just a format. It's a way to declare your styles. But it's not really a full programming language. We don't have like variables and for loops and stuff like that in CSS. It's just a way to describe styling. JavaScript is kind of the third component. It's a scripting language that provides interactivity and dynamic features. So JavaScript is a full-blown programming language, and it runs in the scope of your browser. So your web server, along with your HTML and CSS, will return some JavaScript if you have it, and then your browser interprets that JavaScript, actually runs it, and it can do some different things with the page through JavaScript. So JavaScript has full access to all the HTML on your page, so you can change things. You can create events that happen, like when the user clicks something, something will change. So any sort of interactivity or any sort of dynamic feature where stuff changes on the page, that's usually all JavaScript. So you think of like on Facebook, like the like button. When you click the like button, it'll change colors to blue or whatever, and it'll pop up that you like it. Or now they even have that little pop up that lets you choose your reaction. Right? That's all JavaScript. That's not anything that HTML does by default. Right? So they've written some JavaScript to handle that functionality. So again, anything where you interact with the page, it's all JavaScript. So your browser downloads the HTML from the server, and then the HTML includes the CSS and the JavaScript. So the HTML is the most important piece. That's what your browser gets from the server, and then within that HTML is all the CSS and the JavaScript. Either inline, so sometimes just in your HTML file, you'll have the CSS in there directly or the JavaScript in there directly, or via link. So your HTML can say, here's a JavaScript file you also need to load. And then your browser will also load that JavaScript file or that CSS file. So there's different ways that the HTML can include it, but the main thing that the server returns to the browser is the HTML, and the CSS and JavaScript is all contained within that in some way. Any questions? Okay. Let's talk briefly kind of about static versus dynamic sites. So static sites are what we're going to focus on in this class. They're just HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files that exist on a server. Nothing changes. There's nothing dynamic about them. We also could refer to this as the front end or the client side of a web application. So with just a static site, there's no logging in. There's no adding to carts. There's no none of these dynamic features which would require some sort of other programming running on the server or like a database, stuff like that. Those are what we would refer to as dynamic sites. So dynamic sites use some software hosted on the server to generate HTML for each request. So there's something like PHP or ASP.NET or Java running on the server that handles these different interactions. So you think of when someone logs in, you put in your username, you put in your password, there has to be something on the server that checks that information is correct, right? So it submitted the form, so it has to check the username, make sure the password's correct, and then if so, maybe pull in their profile information and add that information to the HTML, right? So an HTML file itself can't have, your profile information that's dynamically loaded for each user. It has to be provided by some sort of programming on the server. So we don't really dig into that in this class. There's other classes within computer science. What's the one where you guys do like PHP and stuff? Yeah, 330. That kind of digs into the more server side of things and programming languages that actually provide that interaction. So again, anything that has like a login or e-commerce, discussion forums, anything where there's more going on in the page than just static content. So our websites that we build, the HTML has all the information, nothing changes. We can change stuff with JavaScript, but there's nothing dynamic where each user sees something different, or each time you load the page, you see something different. That all has to be done by some sort of server. We also refer to the software on the servers like the back end or the server side. So you hear this distinction a lot in software engineering and in web development about front end versus back end. So the front end is the stuff that we'll look at in this class, which is what the browser renders, what the browser sees, the HTML and the CSS and the JavaScript. The back end is the stuff that may generate the HTML, but it's kind of more dealing with the databases and dealing with logic and those kinds of things. Any questions there? Does that make sense? Cool. Let's talk a little bit about WYSIWYG site builders. So WYSIWYG stands for what you see is what you get. These give you some sort of an interface, kind of like Microsoft Word or PowerPoint or something, where you can type and draw and click to build the website exactly how you want it to look, right? So you can literally just, you know, if something looks too big, you can resize it and now it's smaller. There's some software you can use on a computer, so like Adobe Dreamweaver will do this. Or there's software on the web, which has become really popular, like Wix or Squarespace. I think there's a few others. Even stuff like WordPress can have some of these features. So there's some pros to these. They're really easy, right? So like anyone can build a website. That's like what their ads say, right? Anyone can build a website. And they may have some plugins for dynamic features, like if you want to add products or like, you know, a shopping cart or something, you can usually click around and add that, which is pretty cool. You don't have to do any programming to have people buy stuff from your website. You can add blogs, stuff like that, you know, and you could have a blog where you give access to someone who's not technical. They don't know anything about websites, but they can write a blog and they can just write it and hit post and it's done. Really, really nice. Huge that that's, you know, a growing trend, and huge that the technology is there to do that. There are some cons. It's pretty limited. You're stuck with the options they provide you. If you want to do, I've had to, you know, I have all kinds of people who are like, Craig, you're a web developer, right? I'm like, yeah. And they're like, can you help me with my website? I'm like, yeah, sure. And they pull it up and it's on Wix.com. They're like, I want to move this thing over here and I want to make this thing look like this. I'm like, I don't think that's possible because Wix doesn't let you do that. Like, they're like, why can't you do that? Aren't you a web developer? I'm like, yes, but this is different. This is a, you know, really constrained and limited platform that you're dealing with. So you're stuck with what they give you the ability to do. It can be difficult to update. I've had, you know, clients who, when I've done freelance web development, they'll say like, we want our website to be really easy to update, you know, and they'll maybe say we want to use Wix or Squarespace or something. I'm like, there's some benefits. You can literally go through and click and, you know, change anything, but in some ways you can't, like anything that you want to change, you have to, you know, go to that page and click edit and go to edit it. It's less dynamic sometimes than a custom built like content management system that lets them directly manage the content or maybe even import content from other sources. It can be kind of a pain to deal with your content sometimes. They also sometimes don't really generate clean code or clean HTML, especially stuff like Dreamweaver, although I think it's gotten a lot better. I haven't used Dreamweaver lately, but it used to be you could tell a website was built with Dreamweaver by looking at the source because, like, in order to provide that much functionality and that much flexibility, like where you can just click and drag stuff, they had to do crazy things with your HTML to make that work. So you could just look at the HTML and you're like, this is a mess. No human being wrote this. Like, none of this makes sense. It was obviously generated by a computer trying to make sense of, you know, the user dragged this image over here, and they have to generate code that makes that work exactly. So it's not clean. It's not really very efficient. So there's definitely some cons to using a system like this. So here's kind of like what Wix looks like. This is maybe an outdated screenshot. I haven't looked at it lately, but you know, again, you can, you know, you've got this text box here. You can resize it. You can change the border and stuff like that. You can literally just click on different elements and move them around or edit them. That kind of thing. They've got controls over there. It's pretty nice. But again, it's, you know, like say you wanted to change, you know, welcome text. You have to go in here and, you know, find that text and click on it. Whereas, you know, a content management system might have like edit welcome text, You know, it can be a little bit more customized. So there's some downsides. This is kind of what Dreamweaver looks like. Dreamweaver at least will generate HTML for you, but again, it still has that kind of visual layout and lets you adjust things visually. There's also content management systems. So these are things like WordPress or Drupal or even Tumblr would kind of be considered a content management system. This is software that runs on the web server and gives you a system to manage your content. Usually gives you some theming abilities, so you can like download a theme and add it. You can adjust the theme, maybe change the colors, that kind of thing. There's definitely some pros. It's really easy to manage the content. So the content is, usually content management systems are built for content writers and content editors. So like WordPress is built for bloggers. So it's really purpose-built for writing a blog, adding new blog posts, managing your blog posts, changing the order of your blog posts, that kind of thing. It's really purpose-built for that. Usually you have the ability to purchase themes or get free ones that are usually plug and play. You can just get the theme, add it to your page, and it just magically transforms your site into looking different. And that's pretty awesome. And there's even some really flexible themes out there that let you change the colors and change multiple different layouts. The technology is really pretty powerful as far as theming a content management system. You also can add plugins for added functionality. So if you want to add a cart or e-commerce stuff or a blog, usually you can just, like on WordPress, you can just go to like plugins and search plugins and type in what you want, what kind of plugin, and it's like, okay, here's a plugin that does that. You click add, and now you have that functionality. That's pretty cool when you think about it. So there's a lot of perks to using a content management system. Some cons that can be difficult to set up. If you're using WordPress.com, it's really nice. You just log in and it does it for you. But if you want to actually download WordPress and run it on your own server to have some more control over it, it can be kind of a huge pain. You have to set up a database. You have to, get PHP running correctly. There's a lot of steps to kind of get it running because it's pretty complicated software, right? Like it can do all of these things and build all these kinds of websites, so it can be kind of a pain to set up. Again, also the same thing we run into with Wix, it can be limiting in features, right? You can kind of only do what WordPress lets you do. So there's kind of some limitations to what you can do there. Again, really nice, and I use content management systems pretty often, especially when I was doing freelance stuff with clients because, especially when you're working with clients that aren't technical, they're not going to edit an HTML file, right? They need some sort of interface where they can log in and change the content and edit things. Content management systems usually give you the right balance of that functionality for non-technical users to edit content and technical users and the web developers to create a custom theme and actually adjust the HTML with that theme or add the CSS with that theme. If you really dig into it, WordPress is a powerful tool, and you can really kind of get the best of both worlds in some senses. As a knowledgeable web developer, you can make customizations in the code of WordPress to kind of bend it to your will, but you also get all the perks as well, especially for your clients that aren't interested in learning HTML to update their website. They can use the WordPress interface, and it's, again, kind of the best of both worlds. So really, really common in the freelance world. A lot of marketing agencies use WordPress a lot, or Drupal, to kind of build the websites for their clients. That way they can kind of hand them off and say, okay, your website's done. Here's your login credentials. Go to, whatever your website is, .com/login, and put in your password, and you can manage everything there. So really, really, really useful systems. Here's kind of what WordPress looks like if you've never used it. You've got posts, and you can add a new post and put in your title and your body. And even this, it's kind of like Microsoft Word, right? Like you can bold stuff. So again, kind of a mix between something like Wix or Squarespace and, doing everything by hand. It's sort of something in the middle. Really nice. So after I've told you how awesome content management systems and stuff like Wix is, why are we learning HTML and CSS and JavaScript? Great question. Again, there's lots of options for easy and configurable websites. Ultimately, all of those options, though, boil down to HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, right? So Wix or Squarespace, at the end of the day, they're delivering HTML and CSS and JavaScript to the browser. whoever built Wix has to know HTML, CSS, and JavaScript very, very, very well to be able to build an interface. Even the interface to Wix itself uses HTML and JavaScript and CSS. So like all the drag and drop stuff, it's all HTML and JavaScript and CSS. There's nothing, there's Java or like like Java applets and like Shockwave, but that stuff is kind of going by the wayside. Java's even kind of not supported anymore in some browsers. So now it really is just HTML, CSS, and JavaScript because a lot of there's still like what's Silverlight? I think that's still a thing. There's some other options that kind of provide drag and drop stuff, but most of the time it's just HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So understanding this underlying technology helps you use these tools more effectively. So if you know some HTML and some CSS, you can really have a good time with WordPress because WordPress lets you edit the CSS sometimes. Like if you download some theme, you can even just open the CSS within WordPress sometimes. I know like Drupal and Joomla usually let you do that, but you can actually dig into the CSS and change things. And now you have more flexibility because you know CSS. You can find the theme's CSS files and change them. I have a buddy who like spent years doing WordPress development. He wasn't really a web developer. He was more of like a marketing guy, and he would set up WordPress sites for small businesses and stuff. And so I kind of told him, I was like, hey, you should learn some. He was running into stuff like this all the time, like where he wanted to change something. I was like, you need to learn CSS. He was like, I don't want to. And I was like, you should. And so he did. And I showed him where to find the CSS files for his theme. And he came back to me, like a few months later, and he was like, dude, like, it's so much easier now to build websites for clients exactly how I want them because I can actually change the CSS. I can actually really dig into how the websites works. And it sped up his development time for building these websites. And he could do cooler stuff now because he knew CSS. So even if you plan on using WordPress or if you want to use some of these other technologies, understanding the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript is hugely important to do what you want to. Also, these tools are always changing. Wix and Squarespace haven't been around that long. WordPress has been around for like 10 years, I think, now, but I think Wix and Squarespace are only a couple of years old each. So, the landscape is always changing. HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, they are changing, they're evolving, but they're not going anywhere. They're not going to be replaced anytime soon with an entirely new thing. But hopefully you can build your own version of Wix one day. That's kind of the goal, right? Is to do something cool and add and contribute to the tools that are available to people when it comes to websites. And so understanding the HTML and CSS will give us the ability to do that. Okay, I think that's... Oh, okay. Let's talk about HTML a little bit. We're kind of getting short on time. Maybe we'll go ahead and stop here for now so we can dig into the assignment a little bit for those that need it. So we'll pick up where we left off on next Tuesday, and I'll switch gears a little bit now and kind of talk about the assignment. So if you've already handled the assignment, you've read through like the getting started document, the completing assignments document, and you've already submitted your assignment, you're good to go. But I'm going to kind of run through how it all works real quick for those who need it.